Al Capone. The rise and fall. The story of Al Capone begins not in the marble corridors of Chicago's power, but in the crowded tenements of Brooklyn, New York, in the year 1899. The air smelled of salt and sweat and dreams that barely survived the journey from Italy. Among the thousands of hopeful families was the Capone household, small, poor, and determined to build a life out of nothing. His father, Gabriel, was a barber. His mother, Teresa, a seamstress. They worked hard, prayed often, and believed America would repay their faith. But America in the early 20th century was a place of struggle, where hope shared the same streets with hunger. For young Alphonse Gabriel Capone, the lessons came fast and hard. He was quick-witted, quick-tempered, and allergic to authority. At 14, after striking a teacher who had insulted him, he left school forever. The streets became his education, and gangs his classroom. In the corners of Brooklyn, Al met Johnny Torrio, a man who taught him that crime could be business and that brains would always outlast brute force. Torrio was calm, clean, and strategic, the very image of a gentleman gangster. He took young Capone under his wing, teaching him discipline, patience, and how to turn chaos into control. One night in Coney Island, Al insulted a woman at a bar. Her brother slashed his face with a knife, leaving 3 scars that would mark him for life. From then on, people called him Scarface, a name he despised, but one that fed the legend. He covered the scar with powder and charm, dressing like a man already destined for power. When Torrio moved to Chicago to expand his empire, Capone followed. It was 1919. And the country had just banned alcohol. But America did not stop drinking. It only stopped drinking legally. In the hidden basements and secret rooms of every city, liquor became gold, and men like Torrio and Capone became kings. At first, Capone was Torrio's bodyguard, then his partner. Together they controlled the brothels, the breweries, and the gambling houses. When rival gunmen ambushed Torrio and barely survived, he handed the empire to his protege. Capone, barely 26, became the ruler of Chicago's underworld. He ran his operations like a corporation. Every bottle of whiskey, every poker game, every truck that rolled through Chicago owed something to Capone. His empire earned over $100 million a year, and his name became a brand known from New York to Los Angeles. But power has a scent, and it attracts both worshippers and wolves. Rival gangs wanted a piece of his kingdom. The North Side Gang, led by the ruthless George Bugs Moran, became his greatest enemy. The streets turned into war zones, littered with the wreckage of car bombs and revenge. One of the most daring heists under Capone's rule was the hijacking of an entire shipment of Canadian whiskey coming across the Great Lakes. Disguised as federal agents, his men seized the cargo without a single shot fired. By morning, the liquor was already flowing into his speakeasies. It was said that Capone personally congratulated the crew with gold watches, each engraved with his initials. Another story told of a rival's casino that refused to pay his tax. Capone arrived unannounced with 50 of his men. They walked in politely, ordered dinner, and at midnight, took every dollar from the safe. By sunrise, the owner had signed over the property. Capone left a single dollar bill in the till, a silent message that loyalty was worth more than pride. But not every betrayal came from the outside. Within his ranks, whispers grew. Some of his trusted lieutenants began taking money for themselves. Capone's paranoia deepened. One evening, during a dinner at his Lexington hotel headquarters, he invited several of his own men to eat with him. As the orchestra played, he smiled, raised a glass, and then stood up. In a calm voice, he accused them of stealing. Moments later, the room turned to chaos. Chairs crashed, men screamed, and when it was over, 2 of them were dead. He sat back down, wiped his hands, and continued eating. The violence that had built his empire now began to consume it. The newspapers called Chicago a city of fear. Bombings and drive-by shootings became common headlines. And at the center of it all was one man, charming, generous, and ruthless beyond measure. The event that would define his legacy came on February 14, 1929. 7 men from Moran's gang stood in a cold garage on North Clark Street. They believed they were meeting with bootleggers to buy a shipment of whiskey. A police car pulled up, and 4 men in uniform entered. They ordered the gangsters to line up against the wall. Moments later, the air filled with gunfire. When the shooting stopped, the men were gone, and the floor was red. Capone was in Florida at the time, but everyone knew who had given the command. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre would forever stain his name with blood. In the aftermath, Capone's fame exploded. Some saw him as the face of rebellion, others as the symbol of everything broken in America. He gave interviews, flashed smiles for photographers, and continued to hand out money to the poor. To the newspapers, he was the gangster who couldn't be touched. But the government was watching. President Hoover demanded his arrest, and the Justice Department assembled a small team of incorruptible agents led by Eliot Ness. They were called the Untouchables, men who refused bribes and hunted Capone through his breweries and warehouses. Every raid brought him closer to exposure, but what finally destroyed him wasn't bullets or betrayal. It was arithmetic. Federal agents uncovered his secret ledgers. In 1931, Capone was indicted for tax evasion. He entered the courtroom wearing a suit worth more than a worker's yearly salary, smiling as if the trial were a show. But when the verdict came that he was guilty, the laughter stopped. He was sentenced to 11 years in prison. At first, he served time in Atlanta, where his money still bought comfort. But then he was transferred to Alcatraz, the island prison built for men who believed they were untouchable. There, stripped of influence, Capone became a shadow of himself. The disease he had ignored for years began to eat at his mind. He forgot orders, faces, memories. When he was released in 1939, he was no longer the man the world feared. His health broken, his mind slipping, he returned to his mansion in Florida. His wife, May, who had endured every headline and every humiliation, cared for him until the end. Their son Sonny, shy and deaf in one ear, tried to build a quiet life far from his father's name. In 1947, pneumonia claimed him. He was 48 years old. The man who had ruled Chicago died quietly, surrounded by his family. Stories continued to swirl, of buried treasure hidden beneath his estates, of secret vaults sealed with blood, of ghosts walking through the old Lexington Hotel. Some said his men still guarded his gold, waiting for a sign. Others swore they could hear his laughter echo in the tunnels beneath Chicago. Historians have spent decades separating myth from truth. Some say he ordered more than 400 murders. Others claim he wasn't as violent as the papers made him. Hollywood turned him into a character, a symbol of greed, charm, and power. Actors copied his accent, directors borrowed his shadow, and America, still obsessed with power and success, kept his name alive. His name will never fade, because every generation finds a little of Al Capone in itself. The desire for wealth. But history always wins. And the empire of Al Capone, like all empires built on fear, eventually turned to dust. For a time, he ruled like a god. But every man who builds his kingdom on violence builds it on sand. The tide always comes. Al Capone wanted the world to remember him as a businessman, a gentleman, a man who gave the people what they wanted. And maybe, in his own way, he did. He gave America the truth it didn't want to face, that the line between power and corruption is thinner than smoke. Because when power fades and the lights go out, all that remains is truth. And for Al Capone, the truth was simple. He won the city, but he lost himself.